Hi again and welcome back. Now we'll get into our Gen X module. Now, who is Gen X? Well, Gen X was born between the two largest, most discussed generations of all time, which turns out has given them a bit of middle child syndrome. Did you know that almost 60% of Gen X does not identify as Gen X? Yeah, says a lot. So who are they? Well, Gen X is born between 1965 to 1981. They are defined as former latchkey kids who clung to pop culture in their adolescence and were a huge part of the dot-com boom. The micro-generations here are Gen X, for XS, not for extra small, and Gen Xenos. So let's meet Gen XS. Gen XS is named Michael. Born between 1965 to 1972, Gen XS is between the ages of 45 to 53. There are 40 million of them in the US and 900 million globally. Now, their formative years kick off with that revolution that we talked about with the leading boomer, that sort of hippie freedom. And the thing is that revolution was for adults, not for kids. So it didn't do anything good for them. In fact, it actually changed the dynamic of the family as we knew it at the time. Divorce rates doubled, and moms in the workforce doubled, and so these were kids who were mostly raised by TV and were raised to be very self-sufficient. Now then we get into their adolescence, and as I said earlier, this generation is known for sort of clinging to pop culture in their adolescence. We see a lot of high escapist entertainment, things that were taking them out of the living room and into other galaxies, as well as, of course, MTV. When MTV hit the scene, that gave them a whole new set of goals to strive toward, which paired well with their career-focused parents who were also looking at ways that they could gain more in their lives, making for a time of escapism for all. Now then we get into their early adulthood. And unfortunately for this generation, early adulthood was themed by a little bit of strain, but as former latchkey kids, they were born hustlers. They pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, detached, and made it all work, which is what brought them into a bit of a peak in their adulthood. They were part of that dot-com boom in the first generation to sort of use work as a way to gain true independence, although we know how that story ends. We'll get to that a little later. Now, as I said, this generation was a generation of latchkey kids, which are children under the age of 13 who come home to an empty household and were mostly raised by television. One quote says that boomers may have wanted to change the world, but this generation just wanted to change the channel. And what they changed the channel to was stuff like Star Wars, Knight Rider, Star Trek, this high fiction that was all about showing them a whole new way of living, way separate from what they saw in their own houses. But then MTV came along. And it's no coincidence that the first song to air on MTV was Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles. Yes, all of a sudden musicians didn't just need to make music, they also needed to have big personalities, and it seemed even bigger hair, and they were all super glamorous. Bowie was singing about fashion, the Flying Lizards were singing about money, and that gave this generation a new set of goals to strive toward. Now, unfortunately for them, after that MTV era, they entered into the workforce alongside the 90s recession. And so it seemed for a little while that this generation wasn't going to be able to hit those goals. But the good news is these former latchkey kids held strong to those goals of having their own money, their own car, their own home, not because they were materialistic or excessive, but because to them, these things signified a sense of freedom, a sense of independence from the family life that they never really particularly liked all that much. This is where that famous Gen X work ethic kicks in. This is a generation known for being super hardworking, and to this day, almost 60% of them consider themselves to be revenue generators in their office. And 50 is the average age of the Fortune 500 CEO. Gen XS is very independent, very acquisitive, and most of all, persistent. And thank God, because as we know, the dot-com bubble eventually burst, and that 90s recession, although we recovered for a bit, then eventually led into another recession in the mid-2000s. Unfortunately for this generation, they continue to have to work as hard as they did in their early adulthood, and 60% of them have less than 10K saved for retirement. This is why micro-saving is the perfect insight for them. Micro-saving is all about apps and services that allow members of this generation to enjoy the life that they worked so hard for, while also being able to pay off whatever small debt they may have in their names. One really great example of a product that falls within microsaving is the app Sense. So Sense basically takes every purchase that you make and rounds it up to the nearest dollar, and then takes whatever remaining change is left and puts it toward debts, financial goals, any of it. A way to make being fiscally responsible a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. Of course, this speaks to the fact that Gen XS is independent, acquisitive, and very persistent. Now we move into the younger Gen X microgeneration, Gen Xenos. Now we call her Jennifer. Born between 1972 and 1981, she's between the ages of 37 to 44. There are 26 million in the US and 500 million Gen Xenos globally. Now the Gen Xenos formative years are a little different from what we see with Gen XS. In fact, in the next module, you'll find that Gen Xenos is quite similar to millennials. Often, other research sources will call Gen Xenos the Zennials. Gen Xenos was born to boomer parents, but not during a time of revolution, during a time of panic. Unfortunately for them, a lot of bad things were happening in the world, and although they were too young to understand what they were, they inherited that anxiety from their parents. Now in adolescence, we see something similar to what we saw with Gen XS, this idea of clinging to pop culture, what with the television boom and a new kind of programming that spoke to their inherited anxiety, which was irreverent entertainment. So the kind of entertainment, like The Simpsons, that was poking fun at what were truly serious issues, giving them a way to cope. Now, into early adulthood, we see the rise of something key to this generation, grunge. And grunge, of course, was about a lot more than the music. It was also about giving this generation a way to deal with whatever aggressions are on their plate. And it showed up at a really good time because then they entered into the workforce with the tech bubble bursting, solidifying that pessimism that they kind of always had latent under the surface. Now, lucky for this generation, into adulthood, they had the opportunity to take advantage of all the lessons that they learned and apply them in the second wind of technology in the mid-2000s. And to this day, Gen Xenos are some of our most creative members of society. Now, as I said, they inherited a bit of anxiety, and not just because of what was happening in the world, but also what was happening in the home. In fact, if you think about some of the most iconic movies that we associate with this generation, The Goonies, Adventures in Babysitting, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you see a common theme. Kids getting together to run away from their parents. They didn't like the adults in their lives. Why? Because in 1989, when they were adolescents, divorce rates reached a historical peak. Further to that, 1989 marked the household income all-time low at the time in the US. What that means is that Gen Xenos was likely born to non-nuclear households that were working class at best. And so for them, programs like The Simpsons and other irreverent entertainment really resonated. In fact, if you think about Bart Simpson's character and the fact that he was this apathetic rebel, he really comes to embody the youth culture we associate with the grunge movement. And in a way, isn't Kurt Cobain just a grown-up Bart Simpson? Now, of course, the song associated with Gen Xenos is Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. By far their most commercially successful song. It came out in 1992 when this generation was in their teens and 20s. Now, Smells Like Teen Spirit won the VMA for Viewer's Choice Award in 92, as well as the Grammy for Best Rock Song in 1993. Obviously, Nirvana didn't like winning all of these awards. It's not what they were about. And even Rolling Stone said Smells Like Teen Spirit is either an anthem for or maybe against the Why Ask Why generation. Now, when you get a youth generation that's so rebellious, you have to wonder what happens to them when they enter into the workforce. Well, what happened when they entered into the workforce was the dot-com bubble bursting, which is unfortunate, but the good news is that in order to suffer any personal loss from that occurrence, one had to have had money to lose. This generation didn't have any money to lose. They were only about 25 or so, which meant that they were old enough to understand why what happened, but young enough to not actually feel any personal loss from it. Young enough, in fact, to be able to sit back, absorb the lessons learned from what happened, and apply them in that second wave of technology in the mid-2000s. Gen Xenos is highly pragmatic, still very digitally savvy to this day, and will always be anti-establishment. In fact, 42 is the average age of startup founders in the US, and 55% of all startups are owned by Gen Xenos. So although that big brand CEO tends to be a member of Gen Xers, it's Gen Xenos who are starting those interesting new companies that you can't help but wonder what they're all about. Now, one great insight for this generation is stimulated disruption. Stimulated disruption is all about communities and tools online that just gather people who love talking about new ideas together so that they can discuss what's upcoming and what ideas they have in the pipeline. Gen Xenos is pragmatic, digitally savvy, and anti-establishment. Now that wraps up our section on Gen X. A couple of key takeaways to consider. Gen Xs has a great work ethic and in a lot of ways has molded the workforce as we know it, but they still have some debt to pay down. As for Gen Xenos, this is a generation that had a pretty heavy hand in what it means to work digitally today. They will always be rebellious, so consider exactly what that means for the Gen Xenos employees in your company. So now our workshop questions for the Gen X microgenerations. What could you do to help Gen Xs feel a sense of accomplishment? And how could you better leverage your Gen Xenos employees' rebellious streak?